So it's that time again. Welcome one and all to another episode of That Racing History Podcast, the series that takes stories from the real world of motorsport and puts them into a chilled out audio form that you can consume on the go on YouTube and Spotify to satisfy your motorsport addiction until the next F1 race comes along, which at the time of recording is Sunday. I mean, it clashes with the snooker as well. Oh, decisions. But today I'm visiting yet more calamitous goings-on from the back of the grid, as I delve into the inner workings of the Hispania racing team, or HRT team for short. Now normally I cap the F1 stories around 2008, because after that it's too recent and most of us were there to see it, but this story comes from guest writer Matthew Gordon, who wrote the original Andrea Moda story on Reddit that inadvertently kicked this series off as Storytime, but now That Racing History Podcast. I went from guy that drives sim racing cars to, hey, you're that guy that does the motorsport stuff, the history stuff. Thanks, Matthew. So the story starts in 2009. After the madness that occurred in the initial part of the season with Braun's double diffuser controversy, the other established teams caught them up, meaning that at the end of 2009, there were many teams tipped to be on a very similar performance level. There was Braun, which is now Mercedes, Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, and Renault. So 2010 was indeed hotly anticipated, and we got a close season, even if the majority of those races weren't that exciting. The exceptions being Turkey, where Vettel took himself out, clanging into Mark Webber, and there was Silverstone with the not bad for a number 2 driver thing, and that's it really. But the most interesting thing, at least in regards to this story, is that the FIA had opened up the sport to new privateer teams, because they were anticipating more manufacturers pulling out due to the whole Honda withdrawing thing. There was a global recession going on, if you may remember. And the FIA was actually right. BMW and Toyota would leave, but while BMW was sold back to Peter Sauber, Toyota would be gone entirely. 3 teams joined in 2010, and now all 3 of those have gone. But it's the first of these teams that we're going to look at today. Whether I do the other 2, I don't know yet. Adrian Campos had a rather unsuccessful career in Formula 1. The Spaniard had taken a more unique route into Formula 1 and indeed car racing in general, because he'd begun his racing career with remote-controlled cars. Pretty much like a certain 7-time world champion, come to think of it. Now, having been very successful at that, he decided to move up into actual car racing, coming third in the 1985 German Formula 3 Championship, which was won by Volker Weidler, who later won Le Mans in 1991. His teammates for that win, just as a bit of trivia, were Johnny Herbert and Bertrand Gachot in the Mazda 787B, which is a car I should probably look at sometime soon. Weidler failed to pre-qualify in 8 of his 10 F1 entries for Real Racing, using the same car in which Christian Danner, himself not a particularly special driver, had scored some points and qualified for 4 races. Despite this, Campos was rewarded with a drive in International Formula 3000 in 1986. His first few races were in an uncompetitive March chassis and resulted in 3 failures to qualify. But then he switched to the more competitive Lola chassis for the last 2 races, and Campos performed much better, even qualifying and finishing 6th at his home race at Circuito del Jarama. Thanks to having money, he managed to find a way back into Formula 1 at Minardi for 1987. He was considerably slower than his exciting young teammate Alessandro Nannini, and according to Murray Walker, looked out of his depth in an F1 car. He managed to retire from all but 1 race across the season, which was partly due to the car just being an absolute dog, but he was kept on for the next season because he had rather large pockets. He then failed to qualify for 3 consecutive races in 1988 before being let go after the 5th round, the Canadian Grand Prix, for poor performance. His replacement, Pierluigi Martini, scored points at the next race at Detroit, and quite simply, Campos wasn't good enough for Formula 1, but he still stayed around racing. Campos Racing was set up in 1997 and ran in the brand new Open Fortuna by Nissan series. It was a one-make series with Nissan engines, which would go on to become the now defunct Formula Renault 3.5 series. Campos ran with a very strong driver lineup of future Ferrari test driver and Minardi driver Marc Genet and future 3-time Le Mans GT1 class winner Antonio Garcia. And predictably, they dominated the team's championship, with Genet winning almost half the races in the season and the championship. Genet was snapped up by Minardi for 1999, so Campos went into that season with Garcia and another young Spaniard called Fernando Alonso. Alonso would win the title and helped Campos win the team's championship again. Garcia and Campos swept the board in 2000, before 2001 saw them slip down to 3rd. When the inaugural GP2 season started in 2005, Campos ran a new team, but without much success. In 2007, with a driver lineup of Vitaly Petrov and Giorgio Pantano, they managed to finish third in the team's championship, and took 3 wins. 2 for Petrov and 1 for Pantano. They then stepped it up in 2008, winning the team's championship with a lineup of Petrov and Lucas Di Grassi, who had replaced the uncompetitive Ben Hanley. Di Grassi was extremely impressive, finishing third in the drivers' standings with 3 wins, despite only competing in 70% of the races. Petrov's 1 win and 7th in the standings were just enough for Campos to win the team's championship, 8 points ahead of iSport, who were running the soon-to-be familiar lineup of Karun Chandhok and Bruno Senna. However, better opportunities were on the horizon. On the eve of the season-opening 2009 Australian Grand Prix, Bernie Ecclestone announced there would be new teams admitted to the grid for 2010, saying, "We'll have 26 cars on the grid next year. We've got a lot of people confirmed." Because of the current financial crisis, budget caps would be implemented for 2010 to the tune of around $40 million. While it wouldn't be mandatory to stay within the budget cap, teams maintained low enough spending to be below the limit would have access to greater technical freedom, which supposedly included no limit on how high engines could rev up to and have things like adjustable front and rear wings. This meant that brand new entries, such as a new Campos entry, could enter the sport and expect to be reasonably competitive. In total, there were around 15 new entries for 3 spots on the 2010 Formula 1 grid. Some were very ambitious, such as the myf1dream.com project that was supposed to be some sort of crowd-funded F1 team. So imagine trying to set up a team through GoFundMe or Patreon or whatever. ProDrive and Lola also submitted entries for 2010, despite both of them being accepted onto the grid at some point in the previous 15 years, and not completed a single race weekend between them. Campos were admitted to the 2010 Formula 1 entry list on the 12th of June 2009. They had climbed the mountain and had got themselves into Formula 1, so they had plenty of time to fall back down to the other side. In order to gain funding for their new Formula 1 effort, Campos managed to gain a business partner called Enrique Rodriguez. Rodriguez was the CEO of a company called Meta Image. Meta Image? Yeah, I haven't heard of them either. However, the power of research shows they were founded in 1994 and offer marketing and brand building services for celebrities, whilst managing and promoting sports events. Maybe they're bigger in the Spanish-speaking world, but regardless, the two had been discussing bringing an all-new, all-Spanish team into Formula 1 in early 2009, and when the team appeared on the news, they were known as Campos Meta 1, reflecting the influence of Rodriguez on the team. They also gained a shareholder in Jose Ramon Carabante, who owned the Murcia basketball team. There was also Pau Gasol of the LA Lakers and Jorge Garbajosa of the Real Madrid baloncesto team. All of them were Spanish, in an attempt to create an all-Spanish team. Subaru Aguri had tried to create an all-Japanese team, and the stillborn US F1 team had tried an all-American one. So what could possibly go wrong trying to raise funds to go racing in a country that got shafted quite hard in the 2008 market crash? Campos hadn't realised that there was a small issue. GP2 is a spec series. Formula 1 is not. They had to build their own chassis instead of hiring one from a third party like Toro Rosso had done between 2006 and 2008. They didn't have the expertise and had only been admitted to the grid in June of 2009, so they had 9 months to get something designed and built from scratch, and would have had to have hired something in the region of some people in which to do it. So instead they called Dallara and paid them to build the cars instead, and when they bought the car, have Dallara's intellectual property transferred over as well so they could upgrade it. It would cost them €7 million to do it, significantly less than what it would have cost to do it in-house. The engines were Cozzies, as used by the other new teams coming in, Virgin and Lotus, and they were forced under contract to use them for at least 3 years. At the close of the 2009 season, Campos looked to be semi-stable going into 2010. Their first move was to sign Bruno Senna, who had come second in GP2 in 2008 and was supposed to have had Rubens Barrichello's seat at Honda had they not pulled out. But when Brawn took over, he wanted RB's experience, and instead Senna went to endurance racing. But for 2010, he was searching for an F1 seat, and after many discussion, he chose Campos over Lotus and Virgin. He had backing, youth, junior category experience, and apparently his uncle was pretty good in a Formula 1 car as well. But I can't find confirmation on that. But as time rolled on and the first round of the 2010 season got closer, anuses, or ani, began to clench. Why? Money. The team was put up for sale. With the exception of Carlos Sainz in rallying, Spain has historically been more interested in 2 wheels rather than 4, but interest in Formula 1 had peaked thanks to Fernando Alonso. Interest in a Spanish team, on the other hand, hadn't. Campos needed to pay Dallara, who were very firm with their demands of no pesetas, no party, and had no major sponsors besides those that had come with Senna. South African businessman Tony Teixeira was supposed to buy the team, but this is the guy who came up with A1GP, and that was run into the ground after a few years. The first race in Bahrain was scheduled for the 14th of March. It replaced Melbourne due to something. I can't remember what. It might have been the cricket or something. It doesn't actually say anyway. Was it the Commonwealth Games? No, I can't remember. But anyway, Campos needed a buyer, otherwise the money paid to Bernie and Daddy Max for entry fees would have been wasted. But the fix came via someone inside Campos, Jose Ramon Carabante, who purchased the remaining shares from Adrian Campos and named the team after one of his businesses, Hispania. And so the team came to be, and they had all the typical features of teams in this series that have been flat-out omnishambles. They had an ambitious yet borderline delusional outlook on how they'd possibly succeed. They had the budget of a few bottle caps and decided to hire big names with a non-existent budget, such as Jeff Willis, who is now at Mercedes, and a man whose name I can't pronounce, who is now at Haas. But still, onwards and upwards and all that. While the other teams were scrambling to get their cars to Jerez for pre-season testing, HRT was struggling to scramble an egg. The local council had given them a grant which they used to keep Dallara quiet, and they needed a second driver. Yep, a month to go until the first race, and only one driver. And US F1 was contractually supposed to be on the grid, but they were looking more likely to not be on the grid. So Jose Maria Lopez was in talks to get the other seat, but instead went to future Channel 4 and later Sky Sports resident F1 shill, Karun Chandhok, a man who took me out in a touring car race and stopped me getting my first reverse grid pole. I am still salty about that. Would have been me and Chaz Draycott locking out the front row, it would have been glorious. Oh well, at least it was entertaining on our live stream. Salty, but I can laugh about it. Wasn't 2020 mad? But still, Karun got the drive because he had that Jaguar Land Rover parent company Tata money. It was now only 10 days before the season opener, and HRT had finally wheeled the car out of their garage. But everything appeared to be fully functional and at least had some sponsors on it. And amusingly, they also decided to cover up the rear diffuser. Perhaps they thought other teams would try and copy their amazing new design. Well, Dallara's amazing new design. And while they possibly had the largest brake ducts ever seen on a Formula 1 car, their car was on show and the team were now ready. Although it's not like they would ever get to test the car. They didn't even get a shakedown. They got straight on a plane to Bahrain and got going for their inaugural Formula 1 season. Sort of. No amount of hormone replacement therapy would have solved their issues, and while there were other privateer teams on the grid such as Williams, Force India and Sauber, they at least knew what they were doing and had been around long enough. There was also the big silver, yellow and red superpowers of Mercedes, Renault and Ferrari, the former of which welcoming back one Michael Schumacher. But they turned up to the Bahraini desert anyway and had no expectations whatsoever. Probably for the best, as Free Practice 1 was used as a shakedown, while the others completed 12 straight days of testing with shakedowns and simulator work. But when Senna took it out with 8 minutes remaining in the session, it became apparent as to how bad the car was. It handled like an aircraft carrier and wasn't suited to F1 at all. Chandhok didn't get to run as his car wouldn't even start, and he missed all 3 sessions because of it. He had to be thrown in at the deep end. An end so deep it might as well have been the Mariana Trench. He had to qualify a car without even driving it beforehand. Senna managed 17 laps in the second practice session before a wheel nut fell off, and his best time was a 2:06.9 on the longer endurance layout that wasn't used for very long. It was 11 seconds off the pace of the fastest man in that session, Nico Rosberg. But why was it so bad? Dallara is a well-known and respected company that builds the F2 cars, Indy cars and LMP prototypes today. The reason is HRT asked them to build it too late, and Dallara couldn't get a working car done on time, which is almost a carbon copy of Lola's 1997 effort. But still, onwards and upwards and all that. Yes, I'm reviving that dead meme. HRT had to continue, otherwise the FIA fines would have crippled them. Chandhok was within 1.7 seconds of Senna's time, but still way off the other new boys. Then Chandhok crashed it on lap 2 while Senna managed to overtake somebody. It was Nico Hülkenberg, who had spun. Then the car overheated and blew up, but most embarrassingly, the car was 2 seconds slower than the fastest GP2 runners. GP2 car, arg. Rumours are that the car had steel brakes that hadn't been used since the 90s, and were also running steel suspension arms and wrapped in a carbon fibre vinyl. Talks were going around of bringing back the 107% qualifying rule, as Senna was 107.1% off Vettel's pole time, while Chandhok was 108.6%. Fine at Bahrain or the newer Tilke tracks, but Monaco or Hungary? The only thing going in their favour was that the teams had to unanimously vote in favour of this new rule. So everybody else could vote yes, and HRT could vote no. Democracy. Dallara and HRT parted ways completely halfway through 2010, leaving HRT to their own devices with regards to the 2011 car. And this is before you consider lack of long-term sponsorship and no real technical base. As the season went on, HRT did manage to gradually improve, despite the car being underdeveloped thanks to payments to Dallara being non-existent. It did manage to at least stick to the tail end of the backmarkers though through the rest of the season. Chandhok managed to finish the Australian Grand Prix, but was 5 laps down on Jenson Button's winning McLaren, while Senna and Chandhok both managed to squeeze within 107% of Vettel's pole position time. This ended up being a crucial result. Despite being quite noticeably slower, HRT managed to beat Virgin Racing in the Constructors' Championship. How? They'd managed to finish 14th 3 times to Virgin's twice, and it also piqued the FIA's interest as they used the maximum permitted 4 drivers for the season. Bruno Senna for most of it, Karun Chandhok until the British Grand Prix, Sakon Yamamoto for most of the season after Britain, and Christian Klein for Singapore, Brazil and Abu Dhabi. Aside from a rule at Barcelona that said you couldn't have outboard mirrors anymore, the car went unchanged for the whole year. Except the livery. HRT then quit the F1 Teams Association, or FOTA, saying there was a systematic bias against the smaller teams. FOTA responded by saying they were kicked out for not paying the $84,000 membership fee. A deal was then signed with Toyota to use the unused TF110 chassis as Toyota was leaving F1 after spending an awful lot of money for naff return. Toyota then broke the deal off because, shockingly, HRT hadn't paid them. But it's okay. They had a budget to build a whole new car. I'm going to press X to doubt. It's not a good sign for the sport or for yourself if you're running around with a car sporting such phrases as, your logo here, or this is a cool spot, or this could be you on the side. It might actually be the first ever meme in Formula 1. I don't know, Taki Inui, I guess. But the car itself looked quite appealing. They just had to make it count. Senna was off to Renault to be their test driver, while Chandhok, Yamamoto and Klein no longer had the dollar. Their saviour was Narain Karthikeyan, who hadn't driven an F1 car since he was at Jordan in 2005. But a new car was definitely on the way, although HRT brought their 2010 chassis to the pre-season tests as opposed to their new 2011 entry, the F111. And unlike the F111 Aardvark, it wasn't exactly quick. They also didn't announce their second driver until after pre-season testing. Recently sacked Force India test driver Vitantonio Liuzzi was given the role, and struck a deal with Williams to supply gearboxes and flywheels. The 2011 season was ready to go, even if HRT wasn't. Again, HRT had the Arab Spring to thank for keeping them in Formula 1, the pro-democracy protests that were happening at the time. Had they missed the Bahrain Grand Prix, the fines would have bankrupted them, but the civil unrest in the country gave them more time, and as such they made it to the new start of the season in Australia. But anyway, the team missed the entirety of the first free practice session because they were busy building the cars, and Liuzzi managed to complete one installation lap in free practice 2, leaving the 2011 HRT chassis with about 3.5 miles on the clock heading into the Saturday of the opening weekend. But there was another problem. HRT had designed a new front wing, and they hadn't crash tested it, meaning they couldn't use it. So they had to use the old one. In the first qualifying session, Liuzzi set a 132.9. Vettel set a 125.2. Karthikeyan, meanwhile, was another 2 seconds slower. And once again, the cars had to do their first free practice sessions of the season in qualifying because of having to change the cars. The FIA, meanwhile, was getting bored of the slow cars at the back taking the piss, so they brought back the 107% rule. so the cars didn't qualify. Liuzzi was 109% off, and Carthagena was 110 off. Thankfully, the new wing was successfully tested and they qualified at Malaysia, but their day of days came at the 2011 Canadian Grand Prix, best known of course for Jenson Button's comeback drive after 5 pit stops, as well as a drive-through and being last with half of the race to go. But HRT managed something nearly as remarkable, with Liuzzi and Carthagena finishing 13th and 14th on the road, beating out both Virgins and Jarno Trulli's Lotus in a huge squabble at the end. Carthagena was eventually given a 20-second penalty for cutting the final chicane, although Liuzzi's 13th place was crucially safe. And it wasn't a one-off. Turkey and Brazil were 2 other examples of where HRT were genuinely faster than Virgin, and Virgin's best finish over the course of the season was 14th place, at Canada and Australia. It meant HRT would once again avoid last place in the Constructors' Championship, despite being by far the worst team on paper. HRT are probably best remembered for something else that happened halfway through 2011. They gave Daniel Ricciardo his debut in the sport after Red Bull paid the team about $500,000 to let him drive for the remainder of the season, beginning at Silverstone. Ricciardo was immediately very close to Liuzzi's pace, and eventually began to consistently out-qualify him, which gave Toro Rosso little reason not to sign him up for 2012. Finally, the most crucial thing of all, the team was sold to a new company halfway through 2011, Thyssen Capital. Thyssen's aims were to make the team more Spanish, akin to the aims of Adrian Campos right back in 2009. In a way, they were right. Just that they made the team go like the Spanish economy as opposed to the Barcelona team at that time that was ripping apart the European football. For 2012, the team signed the world's greatest test driver in Pedro de la Rosa, who must have been pushing 75 at this point, and they also re-signed Carthagena. While the team announced they were comfortably going to make the 3rd pre-season test at Barcelona, HRT never turned up at all, although at least this year they managed to complete a 100km shakedown at the same circuit with Carthagena at the wheel. The delay this year was caused by the car failing the FIA crash test at the first attempt, which, necessitated another attempt. And they managed to pass the second time, which meant the team could once again squeeze into free practice at Melbourne. They didn't qualify. The last time a car didn't qualify for a Grand Prix before HRT came along? 2002, when Arrows went bankrupt. Every car has managed to qualify since then. Any cars that were outside of 107% because of dry to wet qualifying sessions have been let in, so there is that exception, of course. They were, though, able to lead the battle of the new teams at Canada, with the team finally managing to fork out the cash for a low downforce setup this year after running the same wings in Monaco as in Monza. This meant the car was surprisingly one of the fastest in the speed traps, allowing De La Rosa to pass both Caterhams and Timo Is That Glocks Marussia in the opening stages of the race, although he later retired with overheating brakes. While the Red Bull garage was party central with all the winning they were doing, the HRT one resembled a funeral. The deadline for registration for 2013 was the 30th of November 2012, and HRT was not on that list. Thyssen couldn't see the point of running the team anymore, with the new expensive hybrids inbound for 2014. There was just no point in them continuing. The first of the 3 new teams fell at the end of 2012, at the end of 2014 the second, and by 2016, all of them were gone. The only person who cared was probably Sebastian Vettel, knowing that he wasn't going to have to face Carthagena again in traffic. HRT was another one of those teams that thought it could run on a shoestring budget like in the good old days, or like they could in Spec Series. And as you've probably discovered, they failed. Somehow, though, they had enough consistency to finish ahead in the championship of cars that were much faster than them on paper, but it all came to nothing in the end. No money, no development. No development, no results. No results, no money, no money, no development. The cycle continues. It also didn't help that the promised cost caps never materialised, which meant Red Bull, Mercedes, Williams, Ferrari, McLaren were able to keep on spending big, while the other teams kept lagging behind, confined to the back of the grid and evaporated in a whisper. Now, sadly, Adrian Campos died of an aortic dissection in the January of 2021, with tributes paid across the Formula One world, mainly from those who drove for Campos in the junior categories. So this has been the full story of HRT, courtesy of Matthew Gordon for sending me the story that he's written and not really done anything with, so Thank you once again, Matthew. If you are listening via YouTube, you can like the video to show you enjoyed, and why not subscribe to get the podcast there first before it gets uploaded to Spotify. For Spotify listeners who have discovered via recommendations, you can follow to get fresh stories delivered straight to your notifications bit, or I actually don't know how it works, to be honest. That Racing History Podcast is a Patreon-backed show, and if you wish to help support this podcast or just my YouTube channel in general at a more personal level, then you can do so by heading to the Patreon page at patreon.com/AidanMillward. That's AidanMillward. So Aidan with an A and not an E. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and all that good stuff. And there is also a Discord where you can join in the chat there. For YouTube listeners, all that stuff is handily in the description box for you. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward with That Racing History Podcast. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.